Here's a quick guide to legally obtaining a gun in New York City. Step 1. Go to the NYPD Licensing Division website. Step 2. Click Apply for CCW license. Step 3. Book your background check and fingerprinting appointment. Step 4. Schedule an interview with your local police department. Step 5. Wait for approval after paying a small fee. Step 6. Receive your license in the mail. And boom, congratulations. You're now legally allowed to defend yourself. That was easy, right? Unfortunately, I actually left a few things out, like how you have to submit 3 personal references, proof of employment history, a mental health evaluation, a detailed letter explaining your need to carry, an in-person interview at the licensing division, and be sure to have enough money saved for the mandatory training and any extra fees that you may incur. Then, wait a few months or up to a year, depending on how fast your local government decides to move. But be warned, because even after all this, you can still be denied. But don't worry. There are no refunds, so that means you're more than welcome to pay again and reapply. Honestly, this whole ordeal might not sting as much if New York weren't so eager to write laws that elevate and insulate certain groups, the ever-expanding class of the marginalized. Individuals who, by virtue of their identity alone, are granted a kind of moral immunity. There's that bigotry of low expectations. Certain members of certain groups that are historically oppressed cannot or shouldn't be held to the same standard as civil society, which explains how we've ended up with a system that punishes responsibility, rewards dysfunction, and carves out loopholes for those who ignore the law entirely. But how exactly did we get here? When did this upside-down approach take hold of New York's entire legal and political machinery? To make sense of New York's current hostility towards lawful gun ownership, we have to rewind to the early 1900s, when the city first began marrying fear-based politics with firearm regulation. Back then, New York City was grappling with a surge in gun violence, much of it, though, tied to Irish and Italian street gangs, labor disputes, and socio-political agitation. This atmosphere of chaos and public unrest became the perfect justification for what would become a turning point in the state's legal treatment of the Second Amendment. The Sullivan Act. Pushed by Tammany Hall power broker Timothy Sullivan, the law would require permits for concealable firearms, allegedly to restore order and prevent political assassinations, as the assassination of President McKinley in 1901 was still fresh in the public's memory. And just a year before the Sullivan Act had passed, in 1910, New York City's own mayor, William Gaynor, had been shot in broad daylight while boarding a ship in Hoboken. So the fear was real, but so was the political opportunism. It's no shock the Sullivan Act passed swiftly, and with it came the creation of a 2-tiered system. The well-connected and wealthy were still able to obtain permits without any issue. But for the working-class New Yorkers, especially immigrants in ethnic enclaves who already had tumultuous relationships with the police, the law functioned as a de facto disarmament. It wasn't just about public safety, it was about control. And from that point forward, New York's gun policy became less about deterring crime and more about deciding who deserves the right to self-defense. And while the Sullivan Act definitely planted the seed for New York City's strict stance on firearm access, it wasn't until the 60s and 70s that the roots truly took hold. Like many urban centers, New York began to embrace a growing ideology, one that saw crime not merely as a matter of personal choice, but as a byproduct of broader societal failings, like poverty, racism, and systemic inequality. Influenced by the social revolutions and civil rights movement of the era, a deeper socio-political and philosophical shift began to shape policy and public perception. But you can only sing Kumbaya for so long before reality kicks down the door. As violent crime and cultural unraveling surged, the same feel-good philosophy that failed to name the problem, let alone fix it, was shoved aside by a wave of top-down conservative governance. Ironically, it was the very chaos that progressive lawmakers refused to confront without pathologizing or excusing that gave rise to broken windows policing, mandatory minimums, and zero-tolerance policies. A very forceful course correction. Controversial? Yes, but in many ways, undeniably effective. By the early 2000s, the heavy-handed strategies of the Giuliani and Pataki years had left a lasting mark. Crime was down, the streets felt safer, and the public had grown accustomed to a government that enforced order with a no-nonsense approach, directly addressing criminality and social decay without pathologizing or theologizing bad behavior. But with that renewed sense of security came a shift in the public mood. The urgency that had once justified aggressive policing and corrective action began to fade. Enter the new leadership, who embodied a more progressive veneer. Gone were the hard-nosed approaches and broken window policing. The new school was to be headed by feel-good technocrats with their fancy spreadsheets, special task forces, and moral euphemism. Though public control was still the goal, it was just delivered through softer speech and bureaucratic sleight of hand, and public safety became a project in behavioral management and theoretical experimentation. This pivot laid the groundwork for a new social philosophy, one that viewed protection and liberty as commodities, solely controlled by the overseeing governing body. It all culminated in 2013 with the SAFE Act, a sweeping package of gun restrictions that tightened the background checks, banned certain semi-automatic weapons, limited magazine capacity, and expanded mental health reporting. And just like that, legal gun ownership was targeted to combat the violence and criminality progressive governance had long downplayed. At the swipe of a pen, what was once broadly understood as a constitutional right became a state-sanctioned privilege, one to be justified, monitored, and paid for in the name of collective security. It's no secret that New York City's hostility toward the Second Amendment didn't happen overnight. This has been a slow, deliberate progression, a calculated shift driven by a political class that insists public safety and security is something only the state should control and have access to. Which brings us to the present. Law-abiding New Yorkers now find themselves trapped in a system that treats their basic instinct for self-preservation as something suspect, an impulse to be scrutinized, licensed, and wherever possible, denied. Now, before I go any further, let me be clear. This isn't about pushing some good guy with a gun narrative. We all know that not every gun owner is responsible or even remotely concerned with public safety. Just like how not every person licensed to drive a 4,000-pound car is. That's not the point. The real issue is the bureaucratic red tape that ordinary citizens are forced to wade through just to exercise a fundamental right. Meanwhile, the actual criminals, the ones that actually break the laws and carry illegal guns, just get a slap on the wrist, sweetheart plea deals, or are simply ignored by a justice system too disorganized or disinterested to keep them off the streets, which only makes it all the more frustrating. For years, despite a growing push for sensible Second Amendment reforms by people who simply want to exercise their God-given rights, find a middle ground between individual freedoms and public safety, and address gun violence without trampling on constitutional protections, New York has refused to budge. Even after the 2022 New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin decision, which struck down the state's proper cause requirement for concealed carry permits, New York doubled down. Instead of adjusting the court's ruling, New York passed the Concealed Carry Improvement Act, which further tightened restrictions in direct defiance of the court's decision. In doing so, it made it crystal clear to law-abiding citizens New York is forever committed to maintaining strict firearm controls, regardless of the push for genuine civil rights reform. Speaking of reform, back in 2017, New York passed the Raise the Age legislation, shifting the prosecution of 16 and 17-year-olds, the people most likely to join gangs, from adult court to the juvenile system. It was sold as a step toward compassion and rehabilitation, but in reality, it only deepened the contradiction at the heart of New York's so-called tough-on-crime stance, where lawful gun ownership and the concern for safety is throttled with bureaucracy, but violent juvenile offenders are handed a second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth chance. It was sold as a step toward compassion. The streets told a completely different story. A spike in juvenile cases with young offenders shielded from adult consequences that treats violence as a symptom of social illness rather than a public threat. The promise was that reform would reduce recidivism. Instead, it's fueled a surge in youth gun violence and gang involvement, all while law-abiding adults remain boxed in by a system more comfortable regulating rights than confronting real danger. We're talking about people with proven records of serious, often violent behavior being cycled right back into the same neighborhood, armed with the knowledge that their consequences are minimal. I sound like a broken record, but the pattern is impossible to ignore. Law-abiding citizens are met with red tape, fees, background checks, training mandates, and endless delays, all just to access a right they're supposed to already have. Meanwhile, the people actually driving gun violence are released back into the community with barely a slap on the wrist. The result? A system where legal gun ownership is strangled by regulation while illegal gun crime thrives. It's no mystery why gun violence keeps rising. The laws aimed at controlling weapons seem mostly to affect those who follow them. And the result? Fewer trained, responsible people carrying firearms. You'd think the answer would be obvious. Empower the people most likely to respect and follow the law, right? But instead, we get more gun-free zones, which are just symbolic band-aids that look good in a press release but don't stop bullets. Because if signs were really a deterrent, then we'd see them plastered all over the South Bronx, East Brooklyn, or Harlem. Places where gun violence is a natural element of reality. But beyond the policy failures and legal contradictions, there's a deeper issue at play: culture. Yes, poverty, inequality, and a lack of opportunity are real factors, but pretending those are the sole reasons or main reasons for the rise in violence is lazy at best. Violence doesn't just appear or exist in a vacuum. It's something that is taught, absorbed, normalized, and in some cases, glorified. I'll go ahead and say what most people won't, that in certain communities, it's not just about survival, it's about status, identity, and power. And until we're willing to confront that hard and uncomfortable truth, no amount of legislation is going to have any effect on what's playing out on the streets. In parts of New York, especially where gang violence and drug trafficking are rampant, criminal behavior has been disturbingly normalized. Modern culture, through rap music, consumerism, and social media, doesn't just reflect this, it glamorizes it. And when this cultural influence collides with a political ethos that refuses to name it for what it is or call it out of fear of being labeled racist or bigoted, it creates a perpetual cycle of violence and scapegoating. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not here to paint entire groups with a broad brush. I'm not trying to deny historical injustice or oversimplify the complex interplay of socioeconomic factors and lived experiences. What I am doing is pointing out patterns of behavior, policy, and political messaging that consistently shift blame from individuals to ideologically vague abstractions. And yet, I'm sure after this lengthy rant, there's some of you that might be thinking, well, no one should have a gun. But denying law-abiding citizens the right to defend themselves only guarantees one thing: more power for those who've already rejected the law. We live in the real world where crime and evil are real elements that people have to deal with. And therein lies the tragic comedy. This is a city where criminality is excused and personal responsibility is buried under a mountain of excuses, all the while treating those who dare to exercise their Second Amendment rights with open suspicion and bureaucratic hostility. At its core, this debate isn't really about safety, it's about control. New York's governing philosophy doesn't just mistrust armed citizens, it treats them as irresponsible outlaws. This brings us to a critical point often lost in the noise of gun control debates: the state's monopoly on force. The idea that only the government should have power, while the instinct for self-preservation is dismissed as irrational and even dangerous. Why is it that in a city where shootings erupt on sidewalks, women are shoved in front of trains, and gang turf wars spill into the playground, that the right to self-defense isn't sacred? Allow me to drive this point home one more time for the people in the back. New York City's stance on guns and criminality is a paradox. It imposes some of the nation's strictest gun laws in the name of safety, while simultaneously rationalizing the very criminal behavior those laws are meant to stop. Yes, it's possible that some criminal behavior stems from systemic neglect, but at what point do we stop excusing destructive behavior and personal choices and start encouraging better ones? You ever hear the phrase, an armed society is a polite one? Oversimplified? Sure, but there's definitely truth in it. When people feel empowered, when they know they can defend themselves, there's a natural check on aggression, and people have the natural respect for each other's boundaries. But New York's deterministic view of justice gets in the way. Instead of confronting the toxic cultural norms that glamorize violence, it points to abstract explanations while sidestepping the harder truth. People make choices, and those choices matter because choices have consequences. It's easier to blame the so-called iron pipeline, the flow of illegal guns from states like Georgia, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, than to confront the ideological and cultural decay festering within the city's own boundaries. Guns do in fact come from other states, but let's be clear about a few things. When we talk about gun crime in New York City, the issue isn't merely where the firearm was purchased. The real issue lies in the obtainment and possession of firearms. See, in New York, owning or carrying a handgun without a NYPL or CCW permit, even if the gun was bought legally in another state, the moment it crosses into New York without proper authorization, it becomes illegal. So these aren't legal guns, they're contraband by definition, and they're smuggled in to bypass the very bureaucratic system that law-abiding New Yorkers are forced to navigate. That's what makes this whole legal guns from out-of-state narrative so disingenuous. It's a rhetorical sleight of hand and a calculated misdirection pushed by gun control advocates to blur the lines and shift the blame. Anybody but themselves, of course. We're told the issue is easy access. It's that all these guns are flooding the streets from other states. This is where the misdirection becomes so strategic, if you don't pay attention, of course. Rather than confront the real crisis, which is untraceable firearms in the hands of repeat offenders, fueled by a system that treats crime as a byproduct of injustice instead of a personal choice, New York's political class doubles down. They tweak their policies and launch new programs, funnel money into vague community-based solutions, all while refusing to look at the culture of criminality that's been allowed to thrive and the collapse of personal accountability that keeps it alive. And as this narrative persists, the law-abiding are punished while the lawless roam free. Legislators and politicians alike refuse to ask the hard questions, and they look everywhere except where the problem actually lies, at the individuals who knowingly break the law and who face little consequences for doing so. In the end, it's really not hard to see that New York's gun policy has less to do with protecting people and everything to do with controlling them.